hope I don't do that. Cool. 3, 2, 1. It is a shame to lean into the very oppression that the movement has spent centuries and decades fighting against. This is what opening opposition does, and that is why they lose this debate. I have two very simple chats. Number one, why will this be done well? This responds to the first substantive that they spent 6 minutes on. And I want to point out, our principal argument from PM is irrespective of this claim, because even if it was done poorly, our argument was that it was important to recognize the diverse lived experiences of individuals, and opposition side fundamentally does not do this. I'm going to first explain why that is the case. The first reason is because opposition, by their own concession, literally defends a world that is right now, one in which heteronormativity exists and one in which you concede that gender is biological. What does this mean? This means queer individuals who, for example, do not identify with the gender or the sex of their birth are literally individuals that are forced to say, no, you cannot have that identity because sex and gender is something that is biological and therefore ascribed towards you. But secondarily, it means that the queer movement is forced to concede to all of the existing literature that is quite conservative. All of the thing that says, e.g., the religious Christian individual that says you're forced to ascribe to these identities. You cannot be trans, you cannot be non-binary because that is not biological. That is something you have learned once you have grown up. This is fundamentally bad because I want to point out this erases these individuals' identity. And this matters because even if it is done in the worst ways possible, we can see the entirety of LO. LO doesn't actually explain what that means. Because even if the queer movement says this poorly, and even if this means it is misinterpreted by people outside of the movement, the point that matters is people who look to the queer movement as the only signal for what they ought believe fundamentally have their identity denied on the side of opposition. At least internally, we're able to validate that uniquely on our side of the house. But here are 4 reasons as to why the movement likely will do this well. The first is because it is quite easy to draw parallels and therefore make this a convincing claim. For the reason that for the average individual, there are a lot of things that they find to be social constructs that they still find to be important. Things like nationality, for example. Things, for example, like your preferences for food. Things, for example, like whether or not you want to have sex before marriage or after marriage, who you want to marry, if you like big house or small house, if you like hairband or no. All of these are social construct and socially construed preferences. And the fact that people know they can have different preferences, because this is quite intuitive to every single individual, because that's what makes us unique, allows the queer movement to weaponize this, to say that, look, you are different because of reasons that belong to you exclusively. This is why gender is something that is unique to you in how you perceive it, but might not be the same for other individuals around us. But incredibly importantly, because the individuals in these movements likely have experiences with dealing with gender. So for instance, oftentimes individuals who are non-binary might be leaders of movements as well. And as a result of that, they know the lived experiences of that. They likely have the ability, therefore, to disseminate and communicate that in a fairly effective way. The LO response here was, no, this is untrue because demographically, most of the individuals who are leaders of the movement tend to be quite gay, or sorry, tend to be either gay or lesbian and not trans. The first thing I want to point out is I think this is just an assertion that this is demographically true. I think in the vast majority of instances, especially with the rising trend of liberalization, it isn't. And that a lot of individuals who are non-binary, for example, are increasingly getting more spotlight in the movement. But second of all, obviously this is scalar. So maybe the individuals at the top tend to be individuals that are only gay or lesbian. But insofar as a couple of individuals who are non-binary or trans exist in the movement, these are individuals who have the ability to also voice out, and therefore you get some degree of that narrative across. But second of all, it is also to say the movement has an active incentive to include individuals within the movement, and therefore there's a race to the top to get the most representative and most good representation of what this likely looks like. For the reason that if a gay individual says, you know, gender is a social construct, haha, but doesn't explain it very well or does not include the voices of trans individual or non-binary individual, they're gonna get canceled, they're gonna get destroyed, and other individuals are gonna rise up, and as a result of that, a race to the top exists. But third of all, I just reject the premise of OO. I don't think it is the case that movements, especially the queer movement, is one that is necessarily centralized that much. Oftentimes they exist as fairly decentralized pockets, and there's a low barrier of entry into accessing things, for example, like Reddit forums or going on Twitter or going on Facebook groups to talk about your experiences. So for example, if you're a closeted individual in Texas, even if there's no immediate community around you, you can still explain by proxy of the movement now saying, you know, we want to perceive gender as a social construct, what that means for you. And therefore there's a lot of voices that likely exist, which means you get to a race to the top in which you get relatively good representation. But finally, I just think it is important to recognize that absent a strong push of this thing, the opposition counterfactual is one in which the queer movement loses the ability to push for anything, for the reason that if you say gender is biological, you literally concede to all of the conservative arguments, and you allow an empowered narrative that says, aha, we were correct. You know, the queer movement was wrong all along, and that is why you raise voices. Second chat then, why do you validate identities far better on our side? Before I explain that, closing opposition.
If you say that gender is a social construct, doesn't this give power to the right to say, oh, you chose to be trans because you saw that your friends were doing it, and actively inflict more hatred on the vulnerable people you try to protect?
No, you don't. Here's why validation of identity is better on our side. I want to point out that if the op argument is you want to give trans individuals or non-binary individuals a safe space, that is fundamentally incompatible and almost impossible if they want to defend the narrative that gender is biological. The first reason is because a lot of traditional conservative arguments then work against them. And the reason why this matters is because a wide array of the average individual who is outside of the movement often finds these arguments to be quite intuitive for the reason that they fit into their daily conception of how the world works. Things like culture, things like religion. Oftentimes, a lot of these things, yes, in the minority of instances, validate third genders or other type of sexuality or gender and sexes, but in the vast majority of instances, oftentimes have a fairly conservative conception of the world. And as a result of that, you force and pigeonhole this conception to be true. But second of all, you're pushing against what individuals find as familiar. So for the exact reason opening opposition gives of why people are going to be uncomfortable with this, it is far more likely that when you say as the queer movement that sex is biological and then try to push a third or fourth conception of gender and sex, people then find that significantly more uncomfortable. Why are we able to sidestep that debate on our side and therefore validate these individuals' identity? This responds to Maria's POI. The first is because you acknowledge that it is a social construct, which means you by proxy acknowledge that people might believe that there are two genders, but that is as a result of their social construct and subjective lived experiences, and therefore that can coexist with your conception of subjective lived experiences. And this is good because this is the least confrontational way of doing it, which means conservatives can still not feel as though they're harassed or wrong, but simultaneously acknowledge that this other perception of truth exists. But second, and more importantly, it makes it far harder for pushback to exist. Because if you say, my perception of truth is that being non-binary is a legitimate thing, and this exists as a result of social construct. If any argument conservatives use to devalidate your identity lands, then that also cross-applies to any values they have. Because then you say, well, your conception of gender is also a social construct. So if you're devalidating my identity, that means your perception is also going to be devalued and devalidated. What that means, that makes it far harder for you to be challenged as a movement. And as a result of that, you're far more likely going to be able to protect the most vulnerable. CF everything Kira says about why there's a principal obligation towards them. We're best able to uphold that. And that is why we win on opening government.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to call upon the DLO to close the opening hub. Here.
Cool. Give me 2 seconds to set up. Okay, before beginning the speech, I just want to note, as a non-binary person, the things I say in this debate are not necessarily reflective of my actual opinions on gender, etc. to anyone watching this in the future. So please don't assume anything about my identity or, in fact, my opinions on other people's identities. This is a debate, making arguments. Cool. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. When you say that something is socially constructed, when you say that the very idea itself does not exist, the labels attached to it do not exist, it becomes incredibly difficult for you as an individual to actually explain your identity. Because when someone asks someone, so what is your identity? What do you define yourself as? How do you see yourself? You cannot use simple language in order to explain that. The language you use has to be complex. It is a multifaceted experience. That is very hard to communicate to someone who does not share that experience. It's very hard to communicate to someone who does not understand what it is you're going through. I think the thing this opening government fails to understand is the idea that at the point you say that something is made up and does not exist, you do not give people a reference point for evaluating their own identities. You do not give them a reference point for advocating to policy and to legislation why they deserve particular sets of rights for individuals. And you ask all of society to reevaluate evaluate how you see their own identities. I think that's particularly important in this debate, because when you compare that to narrative that off-bench prevents you, that gender identity is something that is biological intrinsic, that your mind has always been of a certain gender, and you discovering your gender is simply the process of figuring out over time what was your gender, what is the identity that you always had but never necessarily had the words to express. We are not pushing a narrative that your gender is what your genitals are. The narrative we are pushing is that you were always a woman, or you were always a non-binary person, because that is what your brain is like. That is the hormone balance and the chemicals within your mind that mean you think that way, that it was not just simply something you would pick and choose. That was what gives people's identities legitimacy and transparency. That is why we so clearly take this debate. Several arguments before that, three responses to opening government. Firstly, on the nature of social constructs. Two things under this. Firstly, not believing in gender as a label means you deny any form of categorization around gender. That's particularly important in this debate, because many trans individuals and non-binary individuals derive their identities, explain their identities, and quantify their identities in relation to other people in society through labels that are easy to understand and communicate. Something this team denies, because they say the very idea of those labels is in of itself illegitimate. But we would suggest then the social constructs they have to defend, and note the pushback we give at LO is unresponsive to DPM, which suggests the burden they do have to adopt is quite high, that their narrative is far from the only one that's inclusive, because it misunderstands the idea of what we mean by biology. When you say your gender is something that is encoded within your body and within your genetics, the idea of kind of male-female brains is that you are born in the wrong body narrative that has existed around trans people for an extended period of time, and identity is a process of discovery. That is a narrative that is really inclusive, because it does not reject anyone, because people do not have epistemic access to the chemicals in your brain. You are always able to suggest these narratives and use them in a way you see fit. They are not narratives that lock people out, because you can find a way to identify your gender in a way that is biological. But the very fact non-binary is a category of genders suggests in and of itself that this is an inclusive narrative already that is being pushed, given that they are deviating from the status quo already. Second claim, when they say that this will be done well on their side, the response here is really simple. People are not familiar with social contracts in the way they suggest. One, because the examples they give are largely a set of personal preferences, and personal preferences are not social constructs. That is to say, you having a preferences of what food you like is not a socially constructed behavior, because people have likes and dislikes. That is preferences. That is not a social construct. A social construct is the very fabric of an idea is made up. The best example they give here is nationality. But no, given how closely that tied is to ethnicity and how much people care about the nationality, if you were to tell them nationality is made up, it doesn't exist, why are you supporting exporting team? Is like, you know, it's just an idea that's made up. That is something people take deep offense to, because they are things that are meaningful, and you're denying the basis of that identity in the first place as the reason to why that exists, which means people are unlikely to take these narratives particularly well. Final thing I want to respond to is there's lots of trans people in the movement. Firstly, statistically, trans people are an inordinately small amount of the population, less than 1%. Compare that to gay or lesbian people, who often comprise as much as 10 or 20% in younger age demographics. Just not the case. But two, then not necessarily the narratives proliferate in the movement for this very same reason. But thirdly, them being prolific doesn't guarantee this team to say these narratives are pushed well, because these people describe their gender from a trans perspective, not from a cis perspective, which means the experiences they use to relate to their gender are not things that other people have epistemic access to and understand particularly easily. Which means then that, notably here, the way that gay and lesbian people got rights for themselves was not by explaining their own experiences independently of reality. It was explaining them in relation to things like cis people, that we experience love in this, heterosexual people. So we experience love in the same way. We want marriage in the same way. We want to raise families in the same way. It's the analogizing and similarities that was what got progress, not by stripping yourself and defining it away, which is exactly why this narrative doesn't work. And finally, I want to note really importantly, their concession that this narrative, this movement is one that's incredibly decentralized, makes their burden so much harder to fulfill, because necessarily it means the messaging of this movement is also decentralized. There is not a coherent, consistent, and clear explanation of what gender as a social construct actually means, what it looks like, and what the implications are, which makes it incredibly difficult for individuals to meaningfully understand now what this actually looks like and how this relates to. Cool. First argument, why this creates a legal backslide on trans rights. Quickly noting that the straw man, this argument, their responses to here are inherently premised on a straw man of these identities, which I've already pushed and already defeated the idea that choice is the only thing you get on their side by explaining we get this on our side as well. And notably, the origin and the labeling of identities prevents things like social isolation, because you can find other people experience that narrative. Notably, this argument is incredibly important, because things like trans rights are freshly won. They're incredibly precarious, and there's a huge amount of conservative pushback already in countries like the US or Brazil. Four pieces of characterization. Firstly, these rights were won with biological framings of gender. To say I was born in the wrong body, was always born and viewed this way, and deserve these types of rights. But also, they operate off fairly fixed positions. This idea that you're a trans, a binary, or maybe you're a non-binary is a third overarching category that comprises a large number of people. That's very easy framing to understand, but also it's very easy framing to legislate around, because it means these rights themselves are premised on biology, the same way that many rights are premised on biology. But two, labels themselves are crucial. This is the point you can get this kind of legal categorization, because they're clear crystallizations of your identity. They're easy to explain, they're easy to record in censuses, they're easy to track. Why then does this get worse on their side? But before that, I'll take a point from CG.
Yeah, so I think that in the status quo, conservatives point to this as being a complicated boogeyman and say that the left is in bed with these critical theorists and radicals. But the point of aggressively pushing for something is that you make it a lot more relatable. You say, although it's true that this is an
Okay, so the
intrinsic
problem
feeling
with
I
this
have.
is that obviously it's far worse on your side because the idea of gender social construct literally came from critical theory originally in the first place. That was its origin in academia. This narrative comparatively is far worse on your side, but also we'd suggest that the most conservative people will always push back against this narrative, but we'd argue we capture far more of the middle ground with ours. Continuing this argument then with mechanisms. Firstly, you undermine the features which gave you these rights in the first place, which means you allowed conservatives now to say, oh, well, if gender is made up, the only thing that we can account for is biology, empowering the types of narratives that they want to say exist primarily on our side. It allows you to do things like say gender-affirming surgery is mutilation, because if you do not believe that biologically your brain is a female, you cannot justify why someone, for example, would want to remove their genitalia, or why they would want to get hormone therapy in order to make themselves align more with their internal psychological, biological experience. Secondly, it makes gender feel arbitrary, deprioritizes importance, incredibly destructive to trans individuals for whom gender is a significant part of their identity, and from it's how really important how they relate to the world. Thirdly, society is just bad at dealing with expansive things that are not categories. We often make laws around the fact that they apply to specific people. Affirmative action policies are derived on the idea of the specific criteria that you meet. Fourthly, we just to say that this reduces existing cis support because it undermines their expression of gender as well. Because you're a feminist and you care deeply about your experience as a woman, that is now made up. That is something that does not exist, which means it's far harder for you to get that level of solidarity, and you're far more likely to feel personally attacked, so you push back against it compared to current narratives which are far more compatible. Finally, removing these categories also moves your ability to get future policies because the way you advocate them is far harder. What does that mean at the end of this debate? Very simply, it means quite simply, they make gender something that is seen as far more wishy-washy, far more arbitrary, far more vulnerable to attack. We keep the thing that has gotten policy, we keep the thing that has gotten success and has engaged in the movement. For those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the member of government to continue the debate. Here.
Hi, I'm going to assume everyone can hear me. If you could give POIs in the chat, I will check the chat, so please don't give them verbally. I think the problem with this debate is that OP does not truly contend with their burden of how gender as not a social construct, but a fixed biological idea, often manifests in the kinds of policies and attitudes in the LGBT+ movement. And I think the problem looks like, for example, the idea of trans medicalists who already exist in this movement. The idea that if you do not pursue, for example, top or bottom surgery, that you are not a real trans person, that there are set categories and people who do not fit into that are not welcome or do not fit the exact category that is required. But I think the second and fundamental problem is that it's a lot easier for conservatives to win on the idea that your gender is fixed. It is something we're born with, and you cannot change that. We think that is a logical gap that OP has not addressed. I'm going to talk about that in my speech. Two parts then. Firstly, why do we think the idea of gender as a social construct is a lot easier for the public to buy into and understand? Secondly, why does this broaden the range of policy ideas that we can propose in a much more productive way for transgender people everywhere? Firstly, then, on why we think this is more palatable. The first thing that I want to flag is that gender being a social construct is not some hooey idea that no one has heard of, that only radicalists care about. This is a clear academic idea that several movements have used for decades. The fight for feminism was predicated on the idea that women don't have fixed biology, that they are just mothers and that they're inferior, but rather that they are people who can fight and resist those and aren't defined by their biological gender. The fight for gay marriage is often the idea that people are not biologically predisposed to have to attract the other sex for reproduction, but that's something that they opt into, that they choose, that they want. So I think the idea that OP wants to say that this is a completely foreign idea that people are going to immediately reject is just wrong on face. But secondly, let's talk about this idea of the counterfactual. Because the problem with the idea of gender as biologically intrinsic is that it is so very close to what conservatives are already pushing. Conservatives are already pushing that if you believe that your gender is fixed, it is given to you, then why would you believe that you can change it after birth when it is something that is fixed? It is organs, it is bones, it's, they're going to dig up your bones or whatever Ben Shapiro likes to say on his YouTube channel about trans people. It's much harder if you believe that to think that since you were given that, if you just you get surgeries, you change your name, that's going to magically change this fixed biological gender. This idea of fixed in the minds of people is something the opposition has to contend with on their side. It's incredibly hard to fix that. And I think there's a very easy fix that conservatives have already found to this idea for trans people who want to say, I'm born this way. Their fix is just accusing everyone who is trans of having a mental illness or saying that there's something wrong with them that is disconnected from their biological gender. So no, I don't think OP has been able to meet their burden of this round of proving how they're actually able to beat this conservative ideology, which can be very persuasive for moderates who buy into this concept. I'm going to explain a few things on my side then. The first thing that I'm going to explain is that why is our idea not actually that complicated and pretty easy to understand? The second thing I'm going to explain is why do people like this? And then lastly, how does this coincide with the idea of, trans affirming healthcare being a choice? So firstly, why is this idea fairly simple to understand? We think that most people understand that even if certain things are constructs, they can have a strong preference towards one of them, i.e., many people don't like to be called ma'am because, it makes them feel old. It makes them feel a certain way that they don't align with that. So I think it's pretty simple for most people to understand that even if something is necessarily a construct, that doesn't mean that people are not allowed to have strong preferences or not allowed to want to have certain things that they relate with. But the more important thing that I want to identify here is this idea of presentation and what is needed in order to be transgender. Because there's often, and again, I think opposition has to deal with this, an impulse for if we say gender is biological, gender means you have, X organs and you wish you had X organs and you looked this way. We think often how that manifests is that is how people view and conceptualize all versions of gender. And we think that often leads to the kind of panic that Max flagged in his PY. That is to say, if people think that their kids are going to be experimenting with different toys or different clothing, that means that there is some kind of surgery or something that they have to immediately leap to. And again, I want to be clear that we think that that is obviously an experience that a lot of trans people relate to. But if we're strictly talking about the public and what the average mother, the average parent who wants what's best for their kid in the end, I think the much more clear messaging is that there are many different social constructs of gender and that people have a strong preference for them. If someone you know in your life that you love and you care about wants to opt into a different one, then that doesn't necessarily have to change anything. That doesn't mean that their biology is different, that there's a huge difference with who you know and this person that you raise or this person that you love. I think that it's pretty straightforward for people to be able to tell that at this point, if the LGBT movement is pushing that you should allow people to push these other conceptions of gender, that it's a lot more simple, that if people can buy into the idea that because gender is a social construct, the way you dress, the way that you act, the way you want to be addressed as has nothing necessarily to do with anything intrinsic about you. I think if you're able to detach these ideas, for example, through the recent widespread, idea that people know about drag queens, a lot of people are more accepting of, for example, more feminine ways of presentation for men, which I think is all part of the advocacy that is done under the umbrella that gender is a social construct. That often means that people are a lot less aggressive to this idea in the first place, that when they think of the idea of someone changing their gender identity, changing the social construct that they identify under, we think that's often a lot less hostile to their idea of gender than of biology in the first place. But the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of healthcare, and if it is, if it's not something that is intrinsically biologically to you, why is there a choice? And I think that it is something very simple that advocates have used for a long time. It's just that people are suffering. People feel dysphoria. People want to access different kinds of healthcare in order to be able to feel and express the way that they truly want to on the inside. We think that this is a completely valid response to say, and we don't think it's necessarily complicated or that the movement even has to change their position, because that has been their position, that people, suffer through immense mental distress when they're not able to receive the health resources they need. We think that overall, the primary difference what we talk about is we use these ideas that people are already fairly familiar with. Gender is not something necessarily set in stone. You can choose how to express yourself. It doesn't really matter if you express yourself one way or the other. That doesn't have to change who you are at its base. We think that that is going to be a lot more receptive to a lot of people who are really terrified of ideas of biology and surgery. Sorry, ran out of time to take a PY. The second thing that I want to talk about is policy ideas, because the problem of biological essentialism that often happens under this motion is the idea of what genders exist. It's very, very hard for you to make an argument that non-binary people or other genders should be a final focus of motion or focus of law and politics in particular, when you as the LGBTQ+ movement are saying it is biological, that there's a biological expression, that there's one way that you think this kind of person should look. We think what that means is that it's much harder for you to do things like advocate for passport markers and ID markers that are going to give people, for example, pronouns that they would rather to be with. We think that what this means is that endorses the exact kinds of studies and searches that opposition probably doesn't want to. For example, scientists who are trying to find a so-called trans gene or a trans chemical and are trying to force people to, for example, reach some kind of bar of medical transgenderism before they're allowed to do things like transition. So I think that when you have a much lower bar, or you have a much looser idea of what gender should be and what you are promoting as a movement, you have a more far-reaching ideas of policies that you can push. Because of that, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of opposition to continue the debate. Here.
Just before my speech, I'm fine with recording actually, so if you guys want to record, go ahead. Thanks so much. That's really great.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The pragmatic and unfortunate reality is that the LGBTQ plus movement is a minority of the population. We have a finite amount of human capital. We have a finite amount of resources. The strategies that are effective are strategies that encourage other actors with a lot more resources than us to actively cooperate with us. It is unfortunate, but it is a reality that the only way for corporations and companies to support us if we can focus and emphasize a strategy that can be monetized and that they can actively profit from this. This is going to be the main extension closing opposition. Right off the bat, what are the mechanisms through which this strategy, which is likely to be the dominant strategy because the motion itself says aggressively, thus contributing significantly to that particular policy, are ways in which we are likely to discourage sponsorship and donations from corporations. 3 reasons as to why this is the case. The first of which is that, let's be charitable. Let's assume we can get some results, we can change the minds of some people. The problem is that those results are not quantifiable. What does that mean? Corporations care about sponsoring NGOs and sponsoring social movements only insofar as they can weaponize the results to improve their own public image. That is to say, they wish to showcase, we managed to help this amount of people, we managed to do this type of event that generated this amount of participation, and this many people actively contributed towards that particular event. The reason as to why they do this is you can craft a better image for yourself. You can signal to future employees that you're an LGBTQ plus like establishment. You can signal to investors that you can reach the results for that particular community. You can signal to consumers that are morally conscious that you are actively doing stuff. It's not enough just to support the policy. You must show effectiveness in the results itself. It's much easier for other policies that can be more easily quantified. On their side, it's much harder to quantify the amount of people that you have changed and the beliefs that they have, their beliefs that they have changed. How do you do this? I genuinely don't know, but let's assume it can be done. It would cost additional amount of resources, right? You have to do polls, statistics, research. People can call this out. People cannot deny that you have fed people and given them shelter as a corporation after they have been kicked out once they came out to their parents and they had a negative reaction. But they can actively deny this particular statistic. This is the first reason. Secondly, let's be more critical. It's not clear why, to begin with, you can signal to a corporation that you can reach certain results. Why is this structurally true? Comparatively on our side, it's easier to convince a corporation to give money, so we would provide financial assistance to LGBTQ plus people that are currently materially struggling. It's easier for us to co-host a parade event or to support local community because they already are good at organizing, directly giving cash, or actively doing the logistical part. It's comparatively easier for us to seek to jointly seek to change political legislation because they are already experienced in lobbying, they already have the connections. Comparatively, it's much harder for you, and it's not certain whether you would be able to change the beliefs of people, especially if there are so many exogenous factors that would influence those beliefs, especially if they have been formed for 30, 40, or 50 years. It's not about not being able to reach a result at all. It's about not being certain that you would reach a result to begin with, which makes it just a risky investment. Thirdly, in many cases, those policies are likely to be controversial. And here I want to make this very clear. They're likely to be controversial from the subjective perception of the corporations, meaning what they believe would potentially be risky. Because admittedly, this is not just advertising it, this is just aggressively advertising it in that particular way. There is likely to be backlash from people that like bigotedly believe, but nevertheless believe that those are biological fixed remarks and biological identities by people who are highly religious and likely mean that this clashes with social norms, or many other people that disagree with this particular stance to begin with. Now, the obvious response to this mechanism is, but they're going to backlash anyway to any particular policy. So we have 2 preemptive reasons as to why this is unique relative to other things. The first reason is that you supporting other policies, it's much easier to frame as supporting the basic rights of people, giving them the right to begin with to marry, giving them the right to begin with not to starve out on the street once they were kicked out without financial support. Secondly, it is much less intrusive. If you allow people not to be discriminated, to marry whoever they want, to raise a child in any way they want, this doesn't interfere in the lives of other people. Comparatively, this policy is about aggressively changing the beliefs of other people, it's much more intrusive. The bottom line of this, we're significantly less likely to be able to encourage corporations to support us, to give us their political, economical, and logistical support, and to give us money. Why is this crucial? A, if we care about expressing identity, we must be able to financially support communities that would allow us to express that particular identity. We must be able to organize parades and pride events and communities in general, which would allow people to express that particular identity. We must be able to lobby to get policies that would allow people to have that right to begin with to express that particular identity. Secondly, we have a higher likelihood to protect the rights of people. We want to pass universal anti-discrimination laws, both for adopting a child, for marrying the person that you want, and generally for not being discriminated in the workplace. We can more tangibly do this by ensuring that certain candidates were elected solely because of our grassroots support and because of our political lobbying, and are directly paid by the movement itself to continuously lobby and defend those particular rights. I would say this is a much more important impact relative to your subjective social identity. Before I continue, gladly opening.
OO says you guys defend saying gender is biological. This is a statement with no investment value as well. Corporations probably donate on both sides to be performatively woke, but even if they don't, our argument was that having two genders and a lot of money is less important than making non-binary people feel included in the movement, which you cannot do because you pigeonhole them into heteronormativity.
One POI. Okay, I'll respond to the first. All defense are likely counterfactual, in which we take a stance that is about supporting biological, but we can also do other policies that are highly monetizable. It's not the burden on op to prove why the relative other alternative is going to be in the same way aggressively done. It's the burden on prop, though, that this will be a dominant political issue that you are actively pursuing and that you are doing it aggressively as the dominant policy and strategy that you actively have. Thus, the burden is not on us. Finally, on uniqueness, I just want to be very clear. Average LGBTQ plus people cannot pull together resources to help file a class action lawsuit against anti-discrimination. They cannot pull resources together to change politics because they're inherently a minority. Comparatively on their side, it's not perfect, but you can socially isolate yourself from people that don't respect your pronouns. You can teach your friends and relatives to actively respect them. You still get internal validation from your friends, communities, and social circles. It's not perfect, but it's something that you can feasibly achieve on an individual level. Collectively, we must do policies that benefit everyone with the resources that we can only uniquely get from corporations. On all those grounds, oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And I would like to call upon the government whip to close the debate on Gov Bench. Here.
Everyone hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to start by contesting OO's premise that it's better to aim lower for the short term, by contesting in the very first place whether they'll succeed at becoming more moderate and more relatable to people. But I want to, before I do that, just talk about weighing on the long term, which is that although we agree with opening government that the movement has some very relevant and very important obligations to the most vulnerable within the movement, that is non-binary people, lesbian and gay people, and so on, it also has obligations to people who could potentially be under the future umbrella of the movement. And that includes everyone who feels constricted by the gender box. It means men who are struggling with their modern masculinity and what the role of a man is in society, and probably benefit from buying into the idea that the masculinity that's being imposed on them by their fathers or by media is in some way constructive. So although we think that the movement has proximate obligations, it's also a movement that in theory can be as large as it, meaningfully as possible, as long as more people want to have free identities and be on the binary. So we also want to think about what society we want in the long term. Is it a society that goes for the second best option and says that you must demonstrate that you meet some fictional bar of being a biological woman on the inside, such that you can gain the approval of a movement? Or is it one where you can adopt an argument where I have no idea why op is so negative about the chance of this argument being radically different from any other argument we've made? Because what is the argument for being able to have gender freedom when gender is a construct? It's that agency matters and choice matters. We convinced Americans that gay marriage should exist because we said what people do in their private lives and what choices people want to make are their own, and that agency matters for them. And what we say gender is a social construct, that a man can wear makeup or that someone can exist on a binary, is that they should have the right to this because it's about what they want. It's about their preferences. And I think that is a very salient political argument. It's an argument that succeeded for gay adoption in a conservative United States. So OP's attempt on OO then is to say that there's a very clear delineation that people can make. They can say, in fact, what it means for gender to be non-socially constructed is that there's some inherent womanness inside me. And I actually think that the biggest problem with this framing for their side is that they make it sound a lot more exclusive from the way in which we can describe gender now. That is, it's actually perfectly logically consistent with the burden set out in the motion. And we actually see the social movement, like just look outside, doing this with your eyes, to say, on the one hand, gender is a social construct. What we conceptualize of as womanhood today is different from what will be 100 years, and that's because of various social factors. But simultaneously, that a man can, on the inside, think that they are closer to what a woman is currently under the paradigm of 2023 as a result of the fact that their preferences are closer to that. It's a very simple political message. It's a woman may be constructed, and what a woman is might change day to day, year to year. But I can still feel on the inside closer to one of those things. You should still value that because it's my choice. And it's actually the same rhetoric as OO. OO's rhetoric is I feel trapped inside my body and I should have choice and have agency. And our rhetoric too is I should have choice and have agency. And on both sides, you still need some level of willingness to sympathize with people. And we can call off that too. We can say that people feel trapped by gender, that they can't express who they truly want to be. So I'm not sure that these strategies end up being ultimately so different. The endpoint on ours, though, is a lot more ambitious because it involves deconstructing gender as a whole. That is, it involves, in the long run, people feeling more comfortable with still feeling comfortable, being a man or being a woman or closer to a man or closer to a woman, but wearing different clothes or having different hobbies or preferences that don't necessarily align. So what is Reana's contribution? I think that there are three big things. Number one, she explains why the burdens that OP sets out don't work in the same way that they describe. That is, it's not actually an easier strategy. And in particular, I think that she gives a bunch of reasons why there are viable ways that a movement can convince people with our strategy. Think about the political power that the modern LGBT movement has. Presumably, a lot of educational bureaucrats and a lot of people involved in school curriculum, a lot of them are left-wing, a lot of them have sympathies to the movement, a lot of them have sympathies to lesbian and gay people, and probably buy into a lot of what the new rhetoric is anyway. And of course, there's backlash in the short term. People don't like DEI, they don't like the woke left getting in charge of education curricula. But in the long run, a lot of this stuff works because it changes what kids learn in school and what they ultimately end up believing. They bring that home to their parents. And over time, parents feel social pressure to align with where they feel society is going. So I think that we have a baseline level of efficacy that just comes from the fact that movements have social power, and social shame is a valuable way to get people to shift. But secondarily, she explains why there actually are unique margins in terms of the way that conservatives react to alt strategy, which is when you specifically take out the stance that to be a member of the LGBTQ, the T or non-binary, is to require some change in presentation, to be a woman inside a man's body. Then the fear is that, well, that means my kid needs surgery. That means that if someone is on the spectrum of surgery, they need to formally transition. They need to change their life in some meaningful way. And it makes the bar for experimentation so much higher because the true way in which, so many people who actually are non-binary trans don't express that right now because they're shackled by social norms. And if taking a small step is easier because people believe, even if they don't fully believe it, they just think, okay, it's plausible that gender is a social construct. Like a parent thinks that their kid dressing differently or playing with different toys is just harmless because whatever, it's the new social norm. It's what their peers are doing. Then it's a lot of scary to people. And that fear is real. People are afraid of medicine. They're afraid of surgery. They're afraid of people changing their whole lives. And those are things that are very hard to run a happy movement that gets a lot of people on board with. Oh, well.
Cool. Gender expression is not identity. You and OG both rely on saying social constructs are pushing against gender preferences, that women like pink and makeup and boys like blue. Those are stereotypes of gender, not that gender itself is a socially constructed idea. Please engage the actual burden this motion implies upon you.
Yeah, I mean, technically that is true, but still for us to have a conception of gender, we have to say in general, even if stereotypes aren't real, there are certain characteristics and traits that are more female than male, because that's the entire basis of your political strategy. If the conception of gender on OO is so woke that a parent can't understand that as like, oh, they want to do more girly things or boy things, and I should respect that because I've had the choice, then it's also not going to work very well as a rhetorical strategy. But on opening up, I think that the other big problem, and I pointed this out in a POI that never really got a response in a meaningful way, is that it's always easy to create a boogeyman in the movement. And because the margin in the motion is about aggressively pushing for our policy versus non-aggressively, insofar as the movement, just up until this point, has pushed a lot of this messaging, that relevant critical theorists and people who believe in gender construction have become important figures in movement, it's going to be very easy for the bench of heroes of the world to say that this, even if it's not the main messaging of the movement, is a component of the movement. And that's still scary. You're still shackled to a lot of that radicalism that comes out either way. The difference is that we can explain it in our world, rather than it being confined to academia or parts of the movement that are the most inculcated into the messaging. We can make it understandable to everyday people. We can explain the way in which something being a social construct doesn't mean that your gender doesn't matter to you just because other people reify it and create it. You still have very real preferences for it, but nonetheless, it matters and you should have choice and have agency. The endpoint of this is simple. For OO's strategy to work, they must make arguments about political agency and political rights. The problem is that even if both strategies are similarly effective in the short term, even if theirs is better at getting some conservative parents on board, the endpoint is so much smaller in terms of impact of freeing people from gender norms. You take our side because we explain that way. We also mechanize out why this is explainable in a way that OG doesn't. Very proud of the post.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Now I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close the debate. Here.
Hi, do you hear me well?
Yes.
I am also fine with recording, so yay. Okay, I will start it just a sec. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. So a while back, the only LGBT hub in Sofia was destroyed by conservatives. They wanted to sue them and they tried. However, they couldn't continue with the court case because the movement didn't have enough fucking money. It didn't have enough lawyers to support them. It didn't have any corporation backing them. And that's why when people were physically hurt in this place, there was no justice retribution. I will say, honestly, we are Balkan people. We don't really fully understand all those concepts that you talk about, but we all respect them because it's something that we see constantly, because the movement has the power to reach us through social movements, through people, and through any other means. Meaning, people are going to change even if you don't aggressively push this narrative. And Max says it himself. He says femininity as it was seen before is completely different from now, but we didn't push this narrative and it still happened. Sure, maybe it takes some time, but in the time during that, we were able to do a lot more policy and actual help to people on the ground that we believe as more valuable, even if some people felt a bit unaccepted. I will do extraneous engaging. Firstly on CG, and I really do not kid with this. I fucking hate when teams don't engage with us. What, do you think we are forced that we don't need a response? This is so insulting, and especially by someone who, I don't know, generally debated between us again. No response to Biser's case explicitly. Now, what do they say? Their method is generally that you are able to convince certain people of this narrative easier to others, right? And I would posit 2 things. 1, their main case is predisposed on you changing the opinions of conservatives, because they're the ones that spread those harmful narratives in the first place, who probably influence the moderates. They don't explain why your narrative will be better accepted than their already predisposed views that they've had for years upon years. And the burden of this case is quite big. As I think you intuitively know, every debater knows that forcing conservatives to change is something that is very hard. They have to admit that they were wrong. They have to admit that all that they believed throughout their entire life is something that was false. Therefore, this is a huge burden that I do not think they meet. But certainly, I think we prove solvency on our side of the house better. Because if you care about moderates, which is the best case about CG, we do it better on our side. Because when you have more fair laws that protect against discrimination, you're able to have people rise up to the tops of the corporations and actively implement changes within the companies that help LGBT people. Or for example, when a person doesn't have to stress about them being homeless because people discriminate them to the point that they see on their or they hear or they see that you're LGBT and then you're homeless and you cannot think about anything else. When you're able to have the financial stability that we provide on our side because you have more financial capital, you as a moderate, you're most likely to change when you have a friend that is at your workplace beside you, right? Because you talk normally and you see that this is a normal human being like you. When you're able to see media representation of those stories that actively talk about policy, why it's needed. All of those things are traded off for us aggressively pushing this narrative, taking away money, taking away platform, and taking away media time that is so little and that we do not receive a genuine benefit. But lastly, they say you push this well, but they do not explain why, even if you have the best incentives to do this well, why you have the ability to afford such a big thing. If you want to massively market this, you need money for ads. You need money to actively lobby politicians. You need money to get interviews in the first place. And we provide that on our side in the long run, because if the movement is more financially stable because of corporations backing it, they can do those returns when people are ready to absorb this. But the unfortunate reality is they are not. They do not know what to believe. I genuinely am telling you, this debate happens and everybody has a different perception of what sex and gender is. And we are all educated young people who are willing to be predisposed, but I still don't have a clear vision. I still don't know what is the objective truth, and neither will the average person that you supposedly care about. That's why this policy is ineffective. But certainly on changing people's views, or like people accepting you, I would say, let's accept the best case on GovBench. Maybe you convince some people. Why isn't this most important? One, note that you as an individual, how sad, no matter how sad it is you have many ways through which you can restrict the hatred that you see. What does this look like? One, you can choose to work in a LGBT-friendly corporation. Or two, you actively pick what are your most constant interactions, aka who are your friends, and those are the ones that impact you the most. But thirdly, you can actively limit social interactions that harm you, such as blocking people on Instagram, or not following and actively blocking Fox News so that you don't see their content. All this means you as an individual have the ability to change your circumstances of how you're accepted, but you as an individual cannot shape public policy. That's why the movement uniquely has to do this. The other thing is kind of not as unique in terms of the ability for someone else to do this. They don't provide, the movement specifically has to be the one. We provide policy and sponsorships and all happens only when the movement does this. But certainly, if they are able to convince some people, it just takes too long of a time during which people are physically harmed. They do not have a home. They're constantly prosecuted for things they didn't do, such as that they groomed someone when they didn't. All of those things are more important because it impacts you more intensely. You're not having a home. You going to jail for something you didn't do is something that impacts you in the long run and more intensely than your feelings. OG.
Companies and NGOs can be sympathetic to queer youth being homeless or gay people being beat up. This motion forces us to aggressively defend this in the context of gender and conceptions of it. We can still talk about other issues that is in other.
Prove why there is a trade-off. But even if there isn't a trade-off, it seems like this is the main thing you talk about because you push it aggressively. Therefore, corporations don't want to associate with you as a whole. But secondly, if corporations want to be woke, they would just do another liberal movement. So therefore, the LGBT movement is losing on sponsorships, and now the green movement gets the investment, which is bad for our actor. Now, secondly, on why we beat out, basically, if we explain why people want to perceive this better, but on the comparative why it's better on our side, we beat both GovBenches. But secondly, on all, I would say they potentially prove that you prevent a benefit, such as more members joining, but we prove why you actively limit an active harm, because people right now who are from the LGBT are discriminated to get a job. They're living, they do not have enough resources to do so. And why is money the most important thing? One, it allows for self-expression. The moment you have more money, you can buy the clothes that actively align with your sexual identity. It empowers you in that way. Secondly, you limit restrictive policies. Just don't say gay in Florida because you have lobbyists to defend you. And lastly, it allows you for improvements because you have more time to protest. Very happy to oppose.